Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's October 13th, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Morning, Eric. I'm great. I actually am I had pneumonia and that's cleared up, and sorry to include all our listeners with my cancer journey, but if all goes right, I'll have surgery at the end of this week, which is a weird thing to look forward to. On the other hand, it's an important part of me continuing to move on the path to, slaying this monster. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that. Because I'm having surgery at the end of this week, we're going to skip next week's podcast. And so you can catch our next new episode on the 28th of October. So we'll be taking a week away to regroup. It's weird. And yet I am excited.
We'll miss you next week, but we'll be thinking about you and look forward to hearing you back on the 28th for sure.
Awesome.
As we're getting closer to Halloween, what is your favorite Halloween candy, both to give away and to receive? They may not be the same thing.
Yeah, they're not. You know this to be true. I'm not very sweet. So actually, candy is not my big thing of any ilk. I'm more of a brown and yellow food group kind of gal, salty, bready. There is one, however, and I don't think they even make it anymore. It was called a Caravel bar, and it was kind of caramel in the middle with Rice Krispies around the outside covered in chocolate. And it kind of satisfied my need to be not too sweet and texturally diverse. So for anyone in my demographic group, a Caravel bar was my favorite. Okay, so to give away, because I have spent a life trying to fit 27 hours into each day, and that usually meant, especially when I was in the big kid years, that I was always panic shopping for any holiday. I mean, I think we carved every pumpkin between 4 and 5 o'clock on Halloween Day to get it ready.
Yep, been there.
But from candies, I'd go to try and pick up candy at the last minute. Of course, all the candies are gone, so I fell into the trap of buying full-size candy bars.
Oh, you were that house.
We were that house. And it seemed like we were the nice Gordons.
The affluent nice Gordons.
Yeah, the affluent nice Gordons. But actually, it was the Gordons that were doing no planning for anything and were just trying not to be the other Gordons, which are, they never have anything.
Yeah, the egg and toilet paper Gordons.
Yeah, so my favorite to give away was full-size candy bars to mask my insufficiency in terms of time management.
Nice.
Yeah.
For me, I think it's one and the same. I like to give away Snickers bars because whatever's left over, I then get to keep Snickers bars.
Wait, so you go with only one candy in the bar?
No, we have a bunch of different stuff. I try to shuffle it around so the Snickers get down on the bottom a little bit.
So what do you do? Because Jim and I, when we got to the age that we wanted to go to sleep, instead of staying up long enough, we would just leave a bowl out and trust the kids in the neighborhood to not take too many. What do you do when you're out with the kids about having candy available at your house?
Same thing. Leave it out and then just trust the honor system that they aren't taking more than their fair share. Usually in our neighborhood, there's parents walking around with them and stuff. We don't have as many older kids coming around. And then at the end of the night, when we're running out or when we're tired of the doorbell ringing, we'll just turn off the lights.
Excellent. To the point of, I've never been disappointed with leaving the bowl out in my neighborhoods either. I've never come back to someone having emptied out the bowl into their bag, which proves one of the points we made in an earlier episode, which is contrary to a narrative that seems to have gotten some traction in America these days. My experience is that most people are good and want the same things and have disproportionately the same values. So yours and my leaving our candy bowls out experiences are at least one micro proof of that point.
They're also in a surveillance state with my doorbell camera.
There's that. Yeah. Thanks for dashing my optimism.
All right, let's get to some headlines. This week in the threat picture, did Beijing just flip a kill switch on the world's magnets and chips? Sweeping rare earth controls with extraterritorial reach spooked markets and triggered a 100% tariff threat. Open source intelligence. The future of Intel is going open. We'll discuss an opinion article that argues AI-powered OSINT is outpacing secrets. Venezuela Nobela. Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Venezuelan opposition leader María Corina Machado. we'll discuss the spotlight this puts on President Maduro and for U.S. policy on migration, drugs, and energy in the global south. And finally, quantum leap. Quantum computing seems to be at the precipice of breakthroughs at scale. We'll nerd out a little bit. What is it? How far it's come, and what capability could mean for cryptography, financial markets, and solving complex problems. All right. China last week rolled out sweeping rare earth export controls, framed as protecting, quote, national security that extend well beyond raw oxides to magnets, refining tech, and even foreign-made products containing trace Chinese inputs, reporting that these thresholds will be around 0.1%. In episode 2 of the Understandable Insights podcast, we discussed a U.S. company, MP Materials, winning contracts to bring back some rare earth production to the United States, but their ability to scale is still several months or years out. Given the timing and reports that trade representatives found out from commercial media instead of their Chinese trade counterparts, this strikes me as a flex and negotiation move more than anything else. But what are your thoughts?
We could have predicted it. It highlights one of the interesting things about China as kind of combination adversary, competitor, in some cases trade partner, right? Our
Yeah.
economies are super intertwined. Russia is almost an easy case, right? It seems much more a story of good and evil. And so when you ask people to put up with hardship, AKA tariffs or sanctions or something like that, you'll get a lot of consonants across the U.S. industry, particularly in Western industry, to say, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we want to stick it to them. China presents a different case for lots of reasons. One, they're big and powerful. They have their own set of weaknesses, but much like us on the international stage, they're one of the big players. Two, they actually have some advantages in rare earths.
Oh, yeah.
And so even though I get it, we're trying to bring things back to the United States and shore up our national security supply chains. That just isn't going to happen in the near term. They well know those things, pharmaceuticals are another, where they have an advantage over us in ways that we can't counter. If in this case, we're going to use tariffs to try as a negotiating tactic with China, my guess is to push them back into buying U.S. soybeans or some agricultural product where we're feeling the pinch. You kind of have to be aware of their leverage too. So yes, it's negotiation on both people's sides. Yes, it's worrisome because they do have an advantage in things that we need for everything that we are planning for our future technologically. Yes, it's part game, but I do think it highlights that China is a different case. And when you're trying to bully someone, you better make sure that they don't have the power to do the same thing back to you.
Yeah, it's 90% of the exports of rare earth minerals are from China.
Yeah, and I'll also say that the other 10% of the rare earth market is the global south in Africa and South America, where we have not exactly been proving ourselves the most friendly to them either. If our thought was, well, we'll mine that 10% of the market, we haven't been especially neighborly to those parts of the world either. So it's an interesting ploy. It's a trend worth watching.
Well, let's move on to the Open Intelligence op-ed. So open data at massive scale plus AI is reshaping intelligence from a secrets-first craft into a velocity game of seeing clearly, deciding quickly, and moving first. The authors argue OSINT, powered by AI, should be the foundation, a national asset built largely outside classified spaces and in partnership with the private sector that's already producing high-value insights. They cite examples from Mandiant, CrowdStrike, and corporate teams predicting Russia's 2022 invasion and contend that counterintelligence is undergoing a parallel shift with companies on the front lines. In episode 8, we discussed the need for intellectual leadership and sharing of data and the role of counterintelligence in linking disparate cyber events. What do you think about the author's assertions that the winners will be those who harness data, use AI, and collaborate across public-private seams?
Yeah, I love this article. And Eric, let's make sure that we link it in the show notes so people can go and check it out. This is not 1947 where the intelligence community has to hunt in foreign government computers to be able to find the information we want. The world knows everything. And so it's just a really different data, information, and advantage picture in 2025 than it was in 47. The use of data and the availability data, is vastly different. And since so much of that is open, if you want to be good at knowing a little more a little sooner, which is fundamentally the essence of intelligence advantage, you have got to be seriously playing and using open information. So I love that part of its discussion. The second is because so much of it is available and because we're in a really interesting time technologically, almost anyone with the right tools and interests can mine this treasure trove of open information. And that's not just what's on social media, but that's business records or all the data that people produce as exhaust from the real work they're doing that can actually provide lots of insight. And so this article talks about what has happened when new technologies and all this open data meet in the private sector and what can be done, and talks a lot about not only what companies are doing and what they can offer, but what the private sector is doing for itself in terms of using that open data to lessen their own risks or increase their understandings. And then the third piece it talks about is, and it's not just intelligence, but there's real possibility for using the part of open data that shows patterns and linkages between activities, data, and people that can transform the counterintelligence scene. In other words, what is your adversary or competitor doing against you? And so it's not just that open data can help the craft and discipline of intelligence, but also that of counterintelligence. Now, businesses have long used open data to know more about the environment, and as it became more available, they got better and better. Counterintelligence has disproportionately been the purview of the government and the intelligence community, basically looking for adversarial actions so you can protect yourself or counter those. And so it's been even more of an insider business than intelligence has been for the government. And I think what the article reveals is that same combination of data and technology is now available for counterintelligence use, which is just as valuable for the government and for businesses who, as we've talked about, are part of the threat surface that our adversaries apply. So I think it covers really good, rich depth on each one of those topics. But mostly what it highlights, if you aggregate all that, is the fact that even if the government were to try and use inside its own confines all the world's data for both intelligence and counterintelligence and didn't strike up partnership with some of the really remarkable work that's going on in companies like Strider, that is the company of the author of this article, but DTEX and others that are really doing remarkable things with their technologies and open data in order to provide real security and risk mitigation.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about counterintelligence? Because they talk about in the article how broad of a spectrum that is and how much that entails. And I guess a little bit more specifically, how that pertains from a business perspective through national security.
First, let me just talk about security and risk. We've talked a lot, and actually, the nation and the world have talked a lot about cybersecurity, the technical monitoring and protection of the digital infrastructure across which so much of the stuff that we care about moves. We all know a lot about that discipline of security. There's also physical security. How do you make sure that where your people are protected? You need to make sure that anything that is physical is also protected. The least talked about is security of both your people and against human activities.
Mhm.
One thing I'll just say is this represents a bit of expanding out of thinking that I just cover all my digital endpoints with some protective software, I'm going to be okay. There's a lot going on by our adversaries and competitors that goes through humans. There are kind of a couple ways that you can do counterintelligence. One is we talk about insider threat. That is much more the purview initially of the government, and that's just making sure that you are monitoring the activities of your humans just to make sure that you haven't been penetrated, or if not by purpose, that none of your people have become subordinated, I don't know, through a phishing attack or through an
Mm,
approach to an interest that is not the organization's interest. And so within the intelligence community and within the national security community, that's been around for more than a decade, but mostly because anyone who signs on agrees to have their activities monitored, right? Because they understand that security is part of their mission, not just the organization's mission. What we now know is that it isn't just looking at the insider human threat in governmental organizations, but the truth is companies face the same thing. It is a much more challenging issue externally, and this is where I think the private companies can be really useful because you can set up your own parameters of how you do that monitoring. But I think we now know that governmental targets are not the only targets for counterintelligence activity by adversaries and competitors. The last thing that I'll say is there are lots of ways you can go about sensing intelligence activity. One is by monitoring your own systems, and there are a lot of companies, again, I know one, Dtex, that can be a huge part of doing that within the digital infrastructure that any company has. But another way to do it is look at what the world is doing and what people are doing and what people are targeting. And there's so much data that allows you to do that, to be able to identify even ahead of time what risks are emergent
mm.
and what about your institution is interesting to adversaries and competitors. And that's where Strider is an example of a company that looks a lot at that external environment, using the abundance of data to find the patterns that can reveal intention. I think it's a really opportunistic time just because of the convergence of data abundance and technological capabilities from anyone in the national security domain writ large. Boy, if you're not information dominant, if you aren't constantly thinking about protecting information advantage or assuring information advantage, you're going to have a hard time being as successful as you want to be. That is true for the government, and why I think they must partner with some of these private sector entities. It's also true for companies, and why you have to attend to all aspects of security.
Yeah, because your intellectual property is what makes you unique and differentiated. And if you're not protecting that, the article was kind of, I don't know if cynical is the right word, but it's certainly realistic in terms of how far behind the government is. And there's been talks of developing an OSINT agency, but it's so much broader than that. And I was reminded of our conversation last week when you brought up Taiwan's Ministry of Digital Affairs and the distributed network of cyber detectors that they had by leveraging expats and almost like a cyber militia. Because these companies are spread across such a broad threat surface, do you think there's more value there in leveraging these companies and getting them cross communication and kind of a defense in depth, if you will, of them all working together?
So, on the question of do I think it's overly cynical about the government? Yes, I think it's a bit overly cynical, but I will say they are not wrong about two things. Number one, the approaches that the government has typically had to using data for counterintelligence the way they have has not kept up with either the amount of data, the amount of signal, right? Because that's really what data is in this case.
Right.
It's signal, the amount of signal and the technologies that can be used against it. Listen, the best at counterintelligence are probably still within the government. That's not the issue. The issue is it enough? And is it covering enough? And do they need to do things differently to include partnering really wholeheartedly, not just buying a product and installing it and say, thanks, we'll get back to you, but
Mhm.
actually using the combined resources of what can be done outside and what needs to be done inside and how you use that to best advantage. So, yeah, probably overly cynical on that front, but not wrong that the environment has changed to necessitate what I think is a different approach. On the follow-up about, is there still another level of awareness, involvement, and response that there is to the whole panoply of digital threats we face? Yeah, it's one of the things that's hardest in the US right now is because we're so polarized politically, that data and use of data for warning, for understanding disinformation, for being able to reveal influence activities of any kind because we're so polarized, we are collectively, from a governmental perspective, I think slowed in our use of that data for this purpose. So I love the idea of being much more aggressive about talking to citizens about the threats that they are under and the transportation that they provide to those who would do us harm. I think it is a hard environment for our government to be the messenger or organizer of those efforts. An intermediate step would be making it part of this integrated security approach that with companies or individuals just accepting that not only are you part of a threat surface, but you're also a necessary part of any risk solution. It's going to be hard for the government to play in this space for a bit, but everyone, and we'll try and keep talking about it, needs to understand, and this is a horrible way to put it, that they can be used by those who would do us harm simply by a little bit of manipulation of the same information they're consuming that they think is valid.
Yep. No, we'll talk about this again,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yep.
All right, let's move on to the Venezuelan Nobela.
Yeah.
Last week, Venezuelan opposition leader María Corina Machado won the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for her nonviolent struggle to restore democracy after the contested 2024 election pushed her underground. The Nobel Committee's recognition elevates Machado's profile at home and abroad. As we expected, the award has drawn swift international reaction, from praise to mixed signals from Washington, as Machado dedicates the honor to the Venezuelan people and publicly thanks President Trump. President Trump was publicly seeking this recognition, as we all know, but this is an interesting choice that puts an international spotlight on something we've discussed several times over the past month: U.S. policy and kinetic action against the drug boats and the Maduro Venezuelan government. Sue, what do you think about the selection of Miss Machado by the Nobel Committee?
I love this selection. My reaction is entirely different, where I think this is a triumph of a selection that represents the ideal of the Nobel Peace Prize, just by her actions and what they awarded it to her for, which was kind of the protection and advancement of democracy in the face of forces that would try and diminish its effectiveness. I loved it. My hope would have been that everyone, including the U.S., would have seen it as, oh, that's okay, we can lose to this. You and I both are pretty competitive folks, and I have always never minded losing to someone that was better than me. I never minded losing a job to someone who was a better candidate than I. That was my initial reaction when I heard, like, oh my God, this is great. To U.S. citizens and to President Trump, who think that it would only be worthy if it went to them, you need to be pretty proud of getting to the release of hostages and to the stage of Gaza's ceasefire. I think that is a great example of what the United States and its power has always been able to deliver.
Yeah.
And if it holds, and if Israel and Hamas will continue to abide by it, and if the Arab states continue to support the idea that peace there is a necessary goal for anyone's prosperity, even at a time when the U.S. probably doesn't have all the wasta globally because of some of the tariff activities and some of the assertions the president has made, we still represent that strength to do this sort of thing. And you and I have talked about it before. As important as any physical presence is our positioning as a force for what's right and good, and letting others align against that. If they have to use our power to be able to get there, that's a really good use of American strength. Who knows about next year? But
Right.
I love this election. Interesting, Eric. I was at the Sedona Forum that's sponsored annually by the McCain Institute. And in 2024, Corina Machado won their Courage and Leadership Award. And I had the opportunity to not only hear her daughter speak, but to have a video of her. And much like her reaction on the phone, you cannot hear her speak without being awed by her commitment to her country and to democracy and to the women and men of Venezuela. An inspiring, worthy award. And the last thing is, Eric, Trump said that she gave credit to him and thanked him. She did in that same speech. To her, the U.S. represents a beacon of democracy. And if you think about back to the first Trump administration, where he was also focused on the Maduro regime and its heinous activities, you can see how the U.S. and the opposition in Venezuela were aligned to try and do it. So that tie between Machado and Trump doesn't surprise me much. I hope that the U.S. continues to be the beacon of democracy, that others cite as giving them strength to launch their own battles globally. But this is a great selection, in my experience.
I agree. I think great choice. Interesting choice, especially since we've been talking about it so much. But I imagine they had that on their radar well before. Just like you said, the McCain Institute recognizing her.
Yeah, and if you think about what it cost her, and I think that's always something that I look at is, do you support it when it's easy or do you support it when it's hard? She's basically
Sure.
she's been in hiding for more than a year and still been a beacon and rallying and supporting. This is also, and I think this is where the McCain Institute Award on Courage and Leadership is really well placed in her hands as well.
Let's keep talking about Nobel Prizes and move on to the quantum leap. Last week, the Nobel Committee also recognized some folks who've done some research in quantum. The prize recognized 1980s experiments that proved macroscopic quantum behavior in superconducting circuits, the core physics that turned quantum circuits into an engineering discipline. I'm going to go into a little bit of what quantum computing is, and Sue, feel free to correct me.
Oh, I'm so glad you're doing this, and I'm going to sit back with my Arnold Palmer and enjoy your treatise
Enjoy
on
this
quantum.
physics lesson.
I am.
I am, like in many things, self-taught, this time from Khan Academy, and I will link to that in the show notes as well. Essentially, quantum uses bits, or qubits for short. A bit is a unit of information with two states, and it's often represented as a 1 or a 0. So you think in binary computing, things are either a 1 or a 0. That classic bit must be in either state at a given time. It either has to be a 1 or a 0. But where qubits differ is that they can be in any proportion of the two states, and it can be some degree of both at the same time. Again, anywhere between 0 and 1. This intermediate state is called a superposition, whereas you can create only 4 distinct states with the other two bits. You've got 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. Quantum computers can answer certain problems in a lot less steps because they can perform operations in multiple states in parallel.
Yeah, so think more and faster.
Yep. But any attempt to measure a superposition will cause it to decohere and randomly assume one of the primary states, likely the one it's closest to. Therefore, qubits are incredibly unstable and they can be easily corrupted by noise, creating uncertainty in the system. The quantum level is not actually a physical space smaller than atoms, but more of a realm of physics that govern particles that are smaller than atoms, such as electrons and protons, and therefore a stray photon can decohere a superposition as well. Traditional quantum computers have been unstable, and they have to be supercooled and can only run for a short period of time.
Wait, let's
Yep.
pause. That was really good and a really clear description of something that is almost impossible to wrap your head around. So great job. Bravo.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What'd I forget?
Yeah, it's super cooled because it slows things down.
Yeah.
And it's not just what has to be done to slow the particles down, but getting electronics to be able to connect the computer to the super cool part is its own magical engineering feat and takes part of the time, but that's great.
So, some of the implications we're most interested in, because this is not going to be the computer that replaces your Dell desktop, right? This is for massive computing problems that some of which can be done today, but take up to years to run and solve the problem, and others that today's computers aren't even capable of. One of those is cryptography. Think about cryptography as encryption systems like web logins, banking systems, software updates. They all rely on these complex math problems that conventional computers either find difficult or currently can't solve. A sufficiently capable quantum computer, though, would be able to sift through the vast number of potential solutions of these problems very quickly, defeating current encryption like RSA and elliptic curves. Mature computers would run something called Shor's algorithm. They could factor those keys and impersonate you, no password guessing required. And then if you add the harvest now, decrypt later, HNDL, that's where adversaries can record encrypted traffic today and unlock it years from now once they have a big enough quantum machine or one that's capable enough. So, Sue, wanted to ask you, how are our adversaries already prepping for unlocking some of these codes?
This is a great example of what has long been a national security objective and problem at the same time, for which government investment has been really necessary because we saw this application of quantum computing coming early.
Hmm.
And imagine from a national security perspective what it means if your encryption that has been used to protect all manner of information now is instantaneously transparent. And it's as easy to decrypt really long codes as it is to break a 4-digit password is today. So national security and government has been a big funder of this because of this use case disproportionately, which is encryption relevant quantum and quantum resistant computing. So both sides, right? You want to win the race to be able to make the other guy's encryption transparent, but you don't want to reveal your own. As encryption became what everyone is using, we hope, the problem has just gone exponential, right? And so now it's not just national security threat specifically to the information that governments hold, but it's also financial security and infrastructure protection and personal security and all that stuff. So big concern. This is the one that has been the pacing threat. But like so many cases, we've got a lot of the things that we'll talk about later and benefit. That's just why we care about it so much. The two big nation state adversaries in China and Russia are racing as fast for the exact same reason for it. And if you just look at what's happened over the past 5 years in terms of supercomputer capability, there's pretty good parity in terms of ability, and it is a race.
Yeah.
And when we talk about foreign students and kind of the dichotomy between what's the risk of allowing foreign students to be educated at our universities and what's the risk if we shut them out, this is a really good use case when you just think about the expertise that is now just freely moving around the globe, and it applies to this one. The second thing is, and you mentioned it in the hack and dump, and that is we know that our adversaries are collecting massive amounts of data,
Hmm.
ransomware harvests included, that may not be decryptable now, but they have them, and any time that capability becomes available, then they will be able to go back and look at that data. And we've talked about this before, Eric. The more data you have, the closer you get to the truth. The more data you have, you can find patterns. And the more patterns you can find, you can infer intent. So if all that data that has been encrypted about which we have felt confident of that which has been stolen, it is now a part of the store of information that could be used against us in the future. So it's a dynamic target, dynamic threat, and an area that we have to both follow in terms of threats and vulnerabilities from our adversaries, but we need to continue to advance this capability with alacrity.
Well, that's a downer. I've got some good news.
All right.
We do have some post-quantum cryptography, PQC, that's new math for key exchanges and digital signatures. Standards bodies have picked some front runners. There's some lattice-based schemes like Kyber, you may have heard of, for key establishment, and dilithium for some signatures. And there's also some hybrid models where they'll take some classical encryption and add some post-quantum cryptography stuff during the transition to make things more crypto agile so you can swap algorithms without ripping everything out. In a recent development back in March, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Commerce, NIST, They select HQC as a code-based backup alongside Kyber, which will diversify the cryptographic toolbox. So it hedges against this single math risk. If there's future advances that would undermine the lattice structure, then you've got this other alternative that's ready. And so this joins 3 other types of PQC algorithms that they have developed or that they've sanctioned, saying that in this post-quantum cryptography project that started back in 2016, so to your point of the government's been watching it for quite some time, to potentially head off some of these threats. So what do you think about this diversification aspect and what the good guys are doing here to mitigate?
One relevant to the last conversation on the open source intelligence article, this is another area where I think it's always been true of national security, but especially now, it has to be a public-private partnership. And that's kind of a hackneyed phrase. What I mean is you need at-speed, intimate integration of what is technologically possible and what is necessary from a security perspective. Only when both those forces are acting together that we do really well, certainly as a nation. NIST is one of my very favorite organizations. If you look at its history and what it has been a part of in cybersecurity, in standards across the board, and they have really distinguished themselves in this PQC environment and putting out really good standards that are implementable now, because you said it really well. You cannot wait until the notice comes out in the news that an adversary has made an advance in cryptologically relevant quantum. You have to start now, especially if you're a large organization with information you really need to protect. Your intellectual property, our intellectual property.
Yeah.
You need to start working on your systems, start with an inventory, and just start cleaning up according to the NIST standard. What they're doing is preparing us, but only as far as people decide they're going to use those standards and work on their networks and cryptographic systems today in order to be ready for that world.
It's always valuable to have backups and understanding what alternatives are out
Right.
there and understanding that it's not just one type of mitigation technique. There's other ones that you can use and see which one works best for each industry may be different, right?
One of the things we're trying to do with this podcast is not preach to the insiders, but talk to the folks outside the, I don't know, the arcanity of government to say you're part of this too. Listen to these things going on. And as you look at your life and your organization, think about applying the same lessons and standards that are being applied within the government, and you're going to be in a better position.
Yeah, for sure. And other parts of the government are taking a look at it too.
Yeah.
So the Federal Reserve actually put out a paper in September called Harvest Now, Decrypt Later. And they're using Bitcoin network as an example to study some of this HNDL implication. Distributed ledger cryptocurrency networks rely on traditional cryptography, and they conclude that crypto's distributed ledgers could successfully deploy post-quantum cryptography mitigations that we're just talking about to protect the network security and some of the data integrity from future state quantum. But data privacy of the network's previously recorded transactions are still vulnerable. Those are still downrange, if you will. It also seems that quantum advancements would have less impact on Bitcoin mining and crypto mining in terms of deciphering more of the blockchain. But it's also a good consideration for using a crypto wallet or a ledger, removing your crypto from the exchange, or at least validating what your exchange is doing in terms of crypto security if you're leaving it on there. And like Shannon said in episode 11, it's not FDIC insured.
Yep. But I also think it makes a point that we've talked about before, and that is don't be afraid of all advances in technology, because some advances in technology are not additive risk, but they reduce risk. I like that the Federal Reserve is looking at this to try and see how it can be of benefit and be useful. But you're right. I don't think we've said these words out loud. Technology itself is never the solution. Lots of good, not perfection, generally well served by some intersection of human activity, whether that's your thought process and technology.
We'll stay in the financial sector. And one more implication was HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. They saw a 34% gain from a quantum hybrid trial in bond trading. This recent pilot between IBM and HSBC, they used a hybrid quantum computer. They're able to price in a lot of the things that are hard to gauge in terms of credit, funding, capital adjustments, essentially taking in a lot of extra data that would take hours, days, months to compute and no longer be relevant here with current computers. And you can use a lot of those inputs and have more refined things in the financial markets. So not just cryptography, but we've also got implications in the financial markets and also in pharmaceuticals in terms of drug discovery and drug development are some of the other potential applications.
It really is at the end of the day, even though the technology itself is super cool and hard to understand, it allows you to do more faster, and that allows you better insights, more risk reduction, better performance, and all sorts of things. The only thing I'll say is, one, I'm having a Minority Report moment, and then two is we have all been the victim of a pattern that is discovered that is not actually the perfect representation of what's going on. So I love it as a tool. I worry when it becomes the engine for infinite business decisions, or even more than that, decisions about interactions with humans. I still think the human machine interaction, even applied to quantum, is something that we haven't done nearly enough research on to make the full benefit of these technologies.
Yeah, and how you use the
Yep,
technology,
yep.
like you just said. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some of the advancements and how we're getting closer into this actually being a usable technology. So not only just the hybrid computer that we just talked about, but recently Caltech built a 6,100 qubit neural atom system that works at near room temperature. So this is pretty significant in two ways. One, 6,100 qubits is a lot. Usually we're talking in like the low hundreds in terms of qubits for computers. And also, like Sue mentioned previously, you have to keep these quantum computers really cold, like super, super cold. And so scaling is one of the hardest engineering barriers here, and also the ability to keep it room temperature.
Yeah, there are a lot of near quantum capabilities that are being developed that are going to give you a lot of those advantages beyond the current computing environment. There are also some uses that we haven't talked about as much. You alluded to them a bit in terms of sensing. A lot of sensors being developed that can get much finer grain understanding of phenomena and environments. And so what we'll be able to know about the Earth, how it can be used for navigation in a signal denied environment. So there are a lot of really interesting uses, certainly for medicine is again another one of those early uses where there's so much data and now you can look at activity in a much finer grain.
Yeah, so there's a number of different companies, both private and public, that are in this quantum race. And how do you see it developing as they do take this on? Will these companies maintain the computers and then you lease out compute with them? So think the
Yeah.
Bloomberg portal that stock traders use, or they've
Yeah.
got the compute.
I think that's right. And what you're going to see is now companies moving into the application of quantum, whether it's in the sensing we talked about or the finance that you talked about or in the security space. And as each phase of quantum gets closer to usability, you're going to see the diversification of uses. You're also going to see some infrastructure work in terms of space systems for quantum key deployment. And so one of the ways you know it's getting closer is you're seeing the infrastructure around it also being invested in. There's some really interesting companies out there that are getting close. I know of some of them. IonQ is one, Cold Quantum, but there are a bunch, and they're global and they're interesting. This is a really interesting technology for the AUKUS consortium that we talked about, Australia,
Yeah.
UK, US. This is one of those technologies that may have been generated by national security interests, but you're going to see just its potential explode.
All right. Well, as we watch those moving forward, what else are you watching this week?
I'm going to stay on a couple of things that I've talked before about the government shutdown and the budget. I'm going to stick with my prediction that this is the White House's problem to solve. And every side is going to do some deflection. But I think at the end of the day, one, when you're the party in power, you're the one that have got to get people to come along to your side. And two, I don't think now that the Democrats have put kind of leaned into we'll accede to it, but only if we fix the immediate health care challenge. I don't think they can afford to be the ones that capitulate. So I think we're going to see how this goes. Boy, I hope it's just bluster by the administration that they would use the shutdown as a tool to disproportionately either fire employees or cancel programs. That just feels un-American to me. So I'm still watching that. And I think it will be an interesting week in the Middle East to just see if after the adrenaline rush of the hostage exchange and all the celebrating went on, can Israel and Hamas really stick to it? And I think we have another quiet week, then I think every day you feel better about the work that will have to go into security guarantees and other things that will come along behind it to make for lasting peace. I'm going to be hopeful.
Will the government be open again when we next talk, when we release an episode on the 28th?
Yes.
I think so too.
Yes.
I think so too. Yeah.
This is a no-brainer for President Trump. I think he could even craft it in a way that made him triumphant because he's not one to apologize for anything. So that's what makes me hesitant because that isn't on brand for him. On the other hand, it always was stupid. Remember, Congress, you're supposed to get it done by the 30th of September every year. But I think it's now going to become really problematic. Missing one paycheck is super hard. I think the likelihood that they're going to let people miss 2 paychecks just isn't good for anybody. So, yep, I'm glad we agree that by the time we're back on, the shutdown will be over.
I'm a little more cynical on the peace deal. I just don't trust terrorists.
That's how we'll know, right?
Yeah.
Because after this, it is up to the parties. It is up to the parties. I mean, we've had ceasefires before.
Sure.
But I'm hopeful.
I mean, anything before October 7th was a ceasefire, right?
Yeah. I'm hoping there's not shenanigans financially behind the scenes, but I do think the administration did some things really well around this. One is using its leverage with Israel because it had to do that to stop what was going on in Gaza for even some time. And then doing subtle diplomacy to get the other powers of the Middle East to come along and support it and put pressure on it from Qatar to others. So there are things the administration has done really well to support this, but I'm with you. At the end of the day, it's up to these two parties, and these two parties have a history of sovereignty. But the Venezuela piece is lurking in my mind, too.
Yeah, that's what I'm watching after the novella. Gauge if Maduro is tightening his oppression or if this is going to add international pressure. I'm also watching the Ukraine grid under fire. We talked last time about how Ukraine has some new targeting techniques, long-range targeting capability we've given them. Now the Russians are retaliating, going after energy infrastructure in Ukraine as well, especially as we're heading into winter and looking at if the U.S. is going to give some long-range weapons to Ukraine or not.
Yeah, I think there's more toing and froing to go on that question.
And then last one is we're nearing the deadline for the Commerce Department owing some deliverables out of this AI action plan that we talked about over the summer. So there's an AI export policy that's going to be coming out soon. So looking to see if that gets delayed with the government shutdown, less people at work, or if we'll be able to get some new clarification on that.
And again, I think that's an area where you and I have given credit to this administration. Previous administration policies, in my estimation, have been too government-centric. I do worry that some of these policies are too market-driven centric, and I wish that there was some better mechanism to drive, actually kind of what's been a theme throughout this episode, has been meaningful joint work by the private sector and the government. And so that's within this AI policy. I think one of the things I'll be looking for is, are they addressing the shared needs, or are they leaning toward favoring either security or competitive success? We'll see.
We'll check back in on it in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
As always, remember, we're here for you. Look for a link in the show notes for the stories we've mentioned, but also to provide feedback or suggest topics. Eric and I give each other feedback all the time, and we certainly listen to all of yours. So offer it up if you've got it. Join us the week after next for the Understandable Insights podcast. Please hang with us. We love doing this with you. And go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another. It's exactly what we need.